The wind howled through the desolate, icy plains as the night settled in, cloaking the barren world in a thick layer of frost. The cold, biting air stung against the skin of anyone foolish enough to wander here, but there was no one to feel its sting tonight. At least, that was what the hunter thought as he pulled his cloak tighter around himself, the fabric thick and dark against the backdrop of snow. He had long since stopped caring for the cold. In a place like this, it was a familiar companion. But even he couldn't ignore the strange sensation that gripped him as he made his way through the storm. Something felt wrong, like the air itself was alive with tension. As he trudged through the thick drifts of snow, the sound of his boots crunching beneath him the only noise breaking the eerie silence, he spotted something out of place. It was a faint glow, soft at first, but it grew steadily as he moved toward it. There, in the distance, amidst the swirling snowflakes, something gleamed in the dark. His heart skipped a beat, not out of fear, but out of instinct curiosity, survival, maybe even wonder. He was alone on this planet, as far as he knew, and anything unfamiliar was worth investigating. As he drew closer, the shape became clearer, a figure. A girl, kneeling in the snow, her hair and skin glowing faintly in the dim light of the storm. He could hardly believe his eyes. The planet he called home, well, it had been his home for years, was barren of anything resembling life. Certainly, no one had ever seen another being like this before. Not like her. She was alien, but that wasn't the most startling thing. The most startling thing was that she appeared to be frozen. Her limbs stiff, her skin pale and ghostly against the harsh, white landscape, as though she had been encased in ice for an eternity. Yet she was breathing, or at least, there was a rise and fall to her chest. Was she alive? Without thinking, the man moved quickly to her side, kneeling down beside her. His breath came in ragged gasps, visible in the cold air, and his fingers were numb from the chill, but he couldn't stop himself. He had to know who or what this girl was. The moment his hands made contact with her, though, everything shifted. A surge of energy rushed through him, like electricity coursing through his veins, and he gasped, pulling back instinctively. His eyes widened as he realized that this girl, this being, was no ordinary stranger. The girl's eyes fluttered open, and though her gaze seemed unfocused, it sent an undeniable shiver down his spine. Her pupils, unlike anything he had ever seen before, flickered in the dim light, shimmering with colors he couldn't even begin to describe. The storm seemed to pause for a moment, as though holding its breath. And in that frozen second, the girl whispered something, a sound not from this world. Her voice was soft, almost melodic, but it carried a weight of understanding, as if she had knowledge far beyond anything the hunter could comprehend. "You've found me," she murmured, her words barely above a whisper, but they struck him like a thunderclap. "It's too late to turn back now." He stared at her, frozen in place, trying to understand. Who was she? Where had she come from? And what did she mean by that cryptic statement? But before he could gather his thoughts, the world around him seemed to shift, almost imperceptibly at first, like a ripple across a calm surface. The winds howled again, but this time, it sounded different, more like a warning. The girl's eyes flickered with recognition, then fear, and she gasped, her hands clutching at the snow as if trying to anchor herself to this reality. "They're coming," she said, her voice filled with urgency. "They know you found me." The man's mind raced. Who was coming? What did she mean? But before he could ask any more questions, a sharp, high-pitched sound pierced the air, a sound unlike anything he had ever heard, a piercing wail that seemed to come from the very heart of the storm. He glanced around, but all he could see was the darkness of the swirling snow and the occasional flicker of distant lights from far off in the horizon. He helped her to her feet, instinctively pulling her close to shield her from whatever was approaching. The girl clung to him with surprising strength, her cold hands pressing against his chest. But even as he stood there, feeling her pulse race beneath his fingers, he could sense that something had changed. The atmosphere felt heavier, as if the weight of 1,000 unspoken truths was bearing down on him. And then, just as suddenly as the sound had started, it stopped. The wind calmed. The world fell back into a terrible silence. The girl looked up at him, her eyes now clear and focused. She said nothing, but her expression told him everything he needed to know. Whatever was coming, it wasn't something they could outrun. And that's when he noticed it. In the distance, beyond the storm, there were lights, more than one, moving, approaching with purpose. They weren't natural lights. They were too structured, too synchronized. Ships? No, not ships. Not like any he had seen before. The realization hit him like a cold wave crashing over him. These were not explorers. They were hunters, and they had found their prey. But just as quickly as the dread settled in his chest, a strange calm took over. The girl, this mysterious alien, was not helpless. Far from it. She stood up, her expression hardening as she looked toward the distant lights. She reached for the man's hand and squeezed it, the warmth of her touch somehow piercing the cold, and for the first time, he could sense something powerful, something ancient within her. "We have no time to explain," she said, her voice now steady, even fierce. "But you need to trust me. If we survive this, everything you think you know about this world, about the galaxy, it will change. Forever." And with that, she turned and began walking toward the edge of the storm, her pace quickening, as if the very winds were urging her on. The man hesitated for only a moment, his mind racing to process everything that had just happened. But then, without a second thought, he followed. What had he just become a part of? What was this girl really, and why had fate thrown them together on this frozen night? The answers seemed just out of reach, but as he followed her, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were about to be caught in something much bigger than themselves. Something that would alter the course of everything they knew. The lights in the distance were drawing closer, and the storm was no longer the only threat on the horizon. And that's when the world truly began to unravel. The frozen night held its breath, and the stage was set for a revelation that would echo across the galaxy for centuries to come. But the hunter had no way of knowing that this was just the beginning. The man kept pace behind her, his footsteps crunching in the snow as the wind howled around them, whipping at their clothes and stinging their skin. The girl, barely more than a silhouette now, moved with a swift, determined grace that defied the harshness of the environment. He barely registered the cold anymore. His mind was elsewhere, caught in the swirling thoughts and questions that had begun to take root in his mind since he found her. Who was she? Where had she come from? What did she mean when she said, "They know you found me"? He glanced up at the dark sky, the swirling clouds almost suffocating in their constant movement. The storm was relentless, but the girl seemed unaffected. She didn't flinch when the snow blew harder or when the wind howled louder. She wasn't shivering, like he was. No, she was different. There was a quiet intensity in her demeanor, a sense of purpose that made everything else seem irrelevant. The closer they got to the distant lights, the more certain he became that the danger wasn't just real, it was imminent. His chest tightened as they reached the edge of a jagged cliff. He hadn't even noticed they were walking toward it. The cliff loomed like an unscalable wall, a precipice carved by time, eroded by centuries of storms. But instead of stopping, the girl stepped toward the edge, her breath shallow and quick, like she was anticipating something. "How do you know they're coming?" the man asked, his voice strained, his mind racing. "They always come," she said, her words slow, but deliberate, as though they held weight she couldn't shed. "You don't understand, do you? They don't just seek us out. They hunt us. For centuries, they've been searching, waiting for the moment when one of us would be weak enough to be caught. We can't run. Not from them." "Who are they?" he pressed, urgency in his tone now. "What do you mean, one of us?" She turned to face him then, her eyes those strange, shimmering eyes piercing through the storm. The wind had begun to die down, but the air felt charged, thick with something unspoken. It was almost like she was weighing her words, deciding how much to tell him, how much to trust him. Her lips parted, and for the briefest moment, he saw a flicker of something fear, maybe, or sorrow. "I'm not from this world," she said finally, her voice soft, but it seemed to reverberate with truth. "I'm not even from this galaxy." He blinked, caught off guard by her bluntness. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. His mind had short-circuited. "Wait. You mean, you're saying you're an alien? From another galaxy?" "Yes," she answered simply, nodding. "But that's not the important part. You see, where I come from, there are others. My people. And we've been running for years, trying to stay hidden, trying to escape the ones who want to erase us. There's a reason you've never seen us before. We've always been here watching, hiding. But the moment you found me, everything changed. You've drawn their attention." He stared at her, still trying to process the magnitude of what she was saying. The idea of extraterrestrial life wasn't new to him, not entirely. Stories of alien encounters were whispered in bars, told in hushed tones around campfires. But to stand face to face with someone who claimed to be from another galaxy, someone who looked human but he wasn't sure how to take it. You're telling me this isn't my planet?" he asked, his voice filled with disbelief. The girl looked at him for a long moment, her gaze softening. "This is your world now. But it wasn't always. You were brought here, your species, all of you. You think you were born into this galaxy by chance? No. There's a reason you're here. A reason your kind is so adaptable, so resilient. Your ancestors were chosen, brought here for a purpose." The hunter's heart pounded in his chest. Chosen? For what? But she didn't answer right away. Instead, she walked closer to the edge of the cliff, her eyes fixed on the lights in the distance, which were growing nearer by the second. He followed her, standing just behind her, feeling the same strange pull toward the horizon that she seemed to feel. "They're here," she said softly, almost to herself. "They've found us." The man's gaze shot toward the lights again, his muscles tensing. He could see them clearly now, bright, unnaturally steady beams cutting through the snowstorm. Not like any ship he'd ever seen, not like the old transport crafts used by the few settlers on this planet. These were different. Sleek. Efficient. They were coming fast, and their purpose was undeniable. "They want me," she said, her voice hardening. "But they won't stop with me. If they capture me, they will take everything from you. You won't even realize it until it's too late." The words hit him harder than any physical blow could. He felt a cold knot twist in his stomach, the fear in her voice settling into his bones. This wasn't just some chance encounter. This wasn't some random storm they'd stumbled into. This was a game much bigger than the two of them, one with high stakes, and they were already in the middle of it. "What are they going to do to you?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she looked up at the sky, watching the lights grow closer. Her eyes were filled with a mixture of fear and resignation. "They will extract what they need from me," she said finally, her voice hollow. "They'll use my DNA, my abilities, and they'll leave nothing behind. They've done it before. Many times. But you said they want to erase you. Who are they? Why are they so determined to hunt you down?" The girl's jaw clenched, and for a moment, she said nothing, as though struggling with her own thoughts. When she spoke again, her voice was low, barely audible against the backdrop of the whistling wind. "They're a force of destruction. They see everything as either useful to them or expendable. They're a race of conquerors, and they've taken countless worlds, countless species. My people have always been in hiding. But we can't run anymore. We've been hunted across galaxies, across dimensions. Nowhere is safe." The man's mind raced, trying to make sense of it all. Hiding across dimensions? Conquerors? It was too much to understand in one moment. But there was one thing he couldn't deny: this girl, this alien, was telling the truth. He could see it in her eyes, in the way she carried herself. She wasn't just some refugee or lost traveler. She was running from something far worse than he could even imagine. You said they want you, but... He trailed off, still trying to process. What does that have to do with me? Why are they coming for me, too? She turned back to face him, her eyes intense, as though searching for some sign of understanding. Because you found me, she said simply. Your people, your kind, you've always been a part of the puzzle. You have a role to play in what's coming. I didn't come here by chance. You didn't find me by chance. I need you, and you need me. But if we don't work together, if we don't figure out how to stop them, everything you know will be wiped out. Your world, your people. They will be erased like everything else they've conquered. The wind picked up again, but it was no longer the howling, cold gusts from before. Now it was steady, almost expectant. The lights in the distance grew brighter still, and the man felt the oppressive weight of the unknown pressing down on him. He had no choice but to believe her. Whether he wanted to or not, he was already a part of something far bigger than himself, and that realization was starting to sink in with a cold finality. We don't have much time, the girl said, her voice sharp. They'll be here soon. I can't protect us both unless I show you how. But you must trust me. I can't do this alone. And with that, she stepped toward him, offering her hand in the darkness. The hunter hesitated for only a moment, his heart pounding in his chest. He had no idea what he was agreeing to, but something deep inside him told him that this was his only chance to survive, to protect everything he knew. And so, with a sense of finality, he took her hand. The storm was nothing compared to the storm that was coming. And together they would face it. The girl's grip on his hand was firm, but there was a tremor beneath her touch, something that made the hunter's heart race. It wasn't fear. No, this was something else. Something deeper. She was preparing herself for something she wasn't sure she could face. He could feel it in the way she stood, the slight hitch in her breathing, the way her gaze darted toward the distant lights, now cutting through the snowstorm like a blade through the night. They're too close now, she said, her voice low, a hint of panic creeping in despite her efforts to mask it. We need to move now. The wind picked up again, but this time, it didn't feel like nature's fury. It felt like something else. Something unnatural. The very air around them seemed to thrum with anticipation. The faint hum of distant engines vibrated in the ground, resonating with an almost oppressive force. The hunter could feel it in his bones. Whatever was coming, it wasn't just a force of nature, it was a weapon. And they were standing directly in its path. He glanced over at the girl, who was already stepping forward, pulling him along as she moved with purpose, her eyes locked on the ground ahead. The storm was intensifying, and the blizzard's wide-out conditions seemed to obscure their surroundings even more. But despite the chaotic winds and swirling snow, there was an eerie stillness in the air, as though the world itself was holding its breath. What now? The hunter asked, his voice a mix of confusion and fear. We need to hide, she said, her voice steady despite the rising tension. You don't understand. If they find us, it's over. We won't just be taken, they'll strip everything from us. The power they hold, it's beyond anything you can imagine. They were nearing a rocky outcrop, a natural formation that had once served as shelter for wanderers like him. It wasn't much, but it was enough to conceal them for a moment. He followed her, his eyes scanning the horizon. The lights were nearly upon them now. They were brighter, sharper, more real than before. He could hear the hum of their engines, the low rumble of the ships cutting through the atmosphere like knives. The girl stopped at the base of the rocks, her gaze piercing the distance once more. The hunter followed her line of sight, his pulse quickening as he saw them, three dark shapes cutting through the storm like a predator in pursuit of its prey. There was no mistaking their purpose now. "They'll be able to track us," she muttered, her voice barely audible over the increasing noise of the approaching ships. "The moment we step out in the open, they'll sense us. It's not just their technology, it's something else. They can feel us. And I can feel them, too." A chill ran down his spine at the way she said it. The way she spoke about them like they weren't just invaders from another galaxy, they were something more. Something unnatural. He couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't just talking about technology. There was something deeper, something in her that he couldn't begin to understand. Her voice wavered as she added, "It's not just about escaping anymore. It's about surviving. We can't let them touch us. Not like that. I won't let you be part of that." The girl took a deep breath, turning to face him. For the first time since they'd met, he saw the full weight of her burden. Her eyes, which had once seemed so full of uncertainty, were now determined. There was no turning back. "I have to show you," she said. "There's no other way." The hunter opened his mouth to speak, but before he could ask, she stepped forward, placing her palm gently against his chest. The contact was electric, literally. The instant her hand made contact, the world around them seemed to pause. The air crackled with energy, a faint hum filling the space between them, and then suddenly everything around them shimmered, distorted. The rocks, the snow, even the sky seemed to ripple, as if reality itself was warping, bending to her will. The hunter staggered back, eyes wide in shock, but she held him steady, her hands still pressed to his chest. "Focus," she urged, her voice urgent but calm. "You have to stay focused." The world around him bent and twisted, swirling with strange colors and shapes that didn't belong in his reality. His stomach lurched, and for a moment, he thought he might collapse from the disorienting sensation. But then, through the haze, he saw it. The distant lights were still there, but they were farther away. It was as though they had been pushed back, their presence temporarily masked, hidden from view. The hum of the engines that had once been deafening was now a distant, muffled sound. "How are you?" He stopped himself, too stunned to finish the question. "I'm hiding us," she whispered, her eyes closed, concentrating with every ounce of her strength. "For now. But we don't have much time. They're adapting." The hunter's heart pounded. Adapting? His mind raced as he tried to process what she was saying. How could they adapt? Was this girl, this alien, doing this? Hiding them? Altering the very fabric of the world around them? Was this even real? The energy between them was thick, the crackling in the air a constant reminder of how out of his depth he was. This wasn't just survival. This was something else. He had never felt more insignificant in his life. The girl staggered slightly, her knees buckling as the strain began to show on her face. "I can't hold it for long," she said, her voice strained. "They're starting to break through." Before he could respond, the world around them began to tremble. It was subtle at first, a faint vibration in the ground beneath them. But it didn't take long before the tremor grew stronger, and the rocks surrounding them began to shift, crumbling away as if the earth itself was being pulled apart. The hunter's breath caught in his throat as the lights from the ships became clearer once more. But they weren't just distant now, they were right on top of them. He could hear the ships again, their engines roaring, and this time, the noise wasn't muffled. The world had been torn open. With a final, strained gasp, the girl collapsed to her knees, the shimmering field of energy around them flickering like a dying flame. For a moment, everything seemed to freeze. The ships, the storm, the world itself. Time held its breath. And then, the ground beneath them exploded. A deafening crack split the air, and the hunter felt himself thrown back, his body slammed against the rocky surface as the world around him erupted in chaos. The sky above seemed to split open, revealing the full force of the ships that had descended upon them. He tried to rise, but his limbs felt heavy, his vision swimming. The girl was beside him, her hand reaching for him weakly, her eyes wide with terror. The barrier had fallen. The storm had returned in full force, and the ships loomed overhead, casting long, dark shadows over the fractured landscape. There was no escaping now. And in that moment, as the ships descended upon them like vultures circling their prey, the hunter realized this was it. They had reached the climax of their struggle. The endgame had begun. But what he couldn't yet understand was this: who would survive? And what would be left of them when the dust finally settled? The ship's engines roared louder, and the world seemed to collapse around them. Time was running out. The ships were almost upon them, their engines vibrating the air with an overwhelming force. The girl's hand tightened around his wrist, her grip shaking, but there was something else in her eyes now, a mix of resolve and dread. She was exhausted, her face pale, but there was a quiet fury in the way she looked at the descending ships. Whatever she had been trying to hide them from, whatever barrier she had been holding up, had shattered. It was no longer enough to protect them. The hunter felt the tension in the air, thick as smoke. The ground trembled again, and for a moment, it seemed like everything would fall apart. The snow around them swirled violently, the wind howling louder than before, but the ships didn't slow. They were closing in, their sleek, mechanical forms descending in perfect symmetry, as though orchestrated by some unseen hand. "Get up!" the girl gasped, her voice strained as she pushed herself to her feet. "We don't have much time." She pulled him up with a strength that surprised him. He stumbled, his body still reeling from the force of the explosion. His legs were heavy, his senses spinning as he tried to focus on her, on anything. He didn't understand how they were still alive, how she had managed to shield them for this long, but he didn't have time to ask. Not now. But as he looked at her, something else happened. Something in the air seemed to shift just for a moment, a flicker of light that didn't belong. And then a hum. A low, deep hum, almost like a voice in the distance. The girl's expression changed in an instant. Her eyes went wide with fear, the color draining from her face as she turned to the sky. Her grip on his arm tightened painfully, and she whispered, "It's them. They've already begun." Before the hunter could even ask what she meant, the hum grew louder, more distinct. It was coming from above them now, but it was different this time. It wasn't the ships. No, this sound was deeper, more resonant. It was as if the air itself was vibrating, as though the world itself was shifting beneath them. And then, the ground began to split. It started slowly, a fissure crackling through the snow and ice beneath their feet. But the crack widened, and with it, the temperature dropped. The cold bit into their skin, far colder than the storm had been before. The hunter could feel the shift, the unnatural chills settling deep into his bones. The girl's grip loosened slightly, and he could see the panic growing in her eyes. "No," she whispered, her voice trembling. "This wasn't supposed to happen." "Not yet." They found that too. The hunter could only watch in confusion as the earth beneath them cracked open wider, the ice splitting as though it were being torn apart from the inside. His heart raced. There was something wrong here, something far worse than what they'd been running from. "Move!" the girl cried, yanking him along as she began to run, her pace faster than before, as though she could sense what was coming. The fissures in the ground seemed to follow them, racing beneath their feet like an unseen predator. Every step they took, the earth beneath them shifted, sending cracks spiraling outward. And then, from the depths of the earth, a dark shadow emerged. At first, it was just a silhouette, an elongated figure rising from the broken ground. But as it drew closer, the hunter's breath caught in his throat. He had seen enough of the ships to understand what they were capable of, but this was something completely different. The creature, whatever it was, towered over them. It was humanoid, but its proportions were wrong, too long, too thin, and its movements were jerky, like it didn't belong in this world at all. Its eyes, if they could even be called eyes, were black voids, empty, endless. And the way it moved, the way it twisted and contorted, made his skin crawl. The girl froze, her expression shifting from panic to horror. No, 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 she whispered. It's not supposed to be here. Not now. It's not possible. What is that? The hunter demanded, his voice trembling. She didn't answer, but the look on her face said everything. This wasn't just a ship. This wasn't just some foreign invader. This was something far older, far more terrifying. Something that had been buried deep within the planet, perhaps for centuries, perhaps for millennia. Whatever this thing was, it had just woken up. The creature's head jerked towards them, its body shifting unnaturally in a way that made the hunter's stomach twist. And then, it spoke not in words, but in a sound that reverberated through his entire body, a low, guttural noise that shook him to his core. The girl stumbled back, her hands shaking as she looked at the creature, and then at the hunter. It's not just them. It's all of them. They've been waiting. Waiting for us to awaken them. The world seemed to stop as the creature took another step forward, the ground trembling with each movement. The hunter's heart raced. His mind screamed for him to run, but his legs wouldn't move. The terror was too overwhelming, too deep. The girl was right. This wasn't just an alien ship. This wasn't just a hunt. This was a war that had been brewing for longer than either of them could fathom. No! The girl suddenly screamed, her voice filled with desperation. She stepped forward, her hands raised as if to shield them both, but the creature didn't stop. It continued moving toward them, its steps deliberate, its presence undeniable. The ground beneath their feet cracked again, and the hunter barely had time to react before the ground split wide open, a massive chasm yawning beneath them. The girl was already pulling him, dragging him away from the edge, but the earth seemed to have other plans. Before they could take another step, a sudden surge of energy erupted from the creature, sending a wave of force through the air. The hunter felt himself thrown backward, his body crashing against the jagged rocks. His vision blurred, and for a moment, everything was chaos: the storm, the creature, the ships, all spinning together in a terrifying, unrelenting maelstrom. When he came to, the girl was gone. His breath caught in his chest. Panic surged through him as he looked around, trying to spot her in the blinding snow. He called her name, but the wind swallowed his voice. And then, through the storm, he saw something. The silhouette of the girl, standing in front of the creature. Her arms were outstretched, her body glowing with a strange, ethereal light that seemed to push back the darkness. But even as he watched, her light flickered, fading, dying. He had to move. He had to save her. But he wasn't sure he could reach her in time. And as the ground trembled beneath him once again, he realized the true nature of what they were up against. It wasn't just the invaders from the stars, it was something much, much older. And if they didn't act fast, they would be consumed by it. The true war had begun. The hunter's heart pounded in his chest as he sprinted toward the girl, the world around him spinning and shaking. The ground was alive, alive with energy he could barely understand. The creature stood in front of her, towering and still, its dark eyes fixed on her like a predator preparing to strike. The girl's hands trembled as she stretched them out in front of her, her body glowing with that strange, ethereal light. He couldn't reach her fast enough. Her light was dimming, flickering like a dying flame. Panic surged through him, but he pushed it down. There was no time for fear. He had to get to her, had to do something, anything to save her. He barreled forward, the snow beneath him thick and slippery, the winds cutting like daggers. The chasm that had opened in the ground was widening, and he could see the earth starting to split farther, swallowing everything in its path. If they didn't stop this now, it would all be over. The creature's head tilted slightly as the girl faltered, her light flickering more violently. It seemed to recognize the weakness, the failing energy that had once protected them. The air around them thickened, heavy with an oppressive force. His stomach churned as a pressure built in the atmosphere, squeezing in on him from all sides. "Don't let it win!" he shouted, his voice raw with desperation. The girl's eyes flickered toward him, and for a split second, he saw the fear in them, the terror of knowing they were running out of time. But then something shifted in her. It was subtle, but it was there. Her eyes narrowed, a new determination sparking within them. She turned to face the creature, her voice steady despite the tremble in her chest. "You have no hold over me anymore." The words were strange, but the hunter could feel the weight of them. They weren't just words. They were a declaration. A challenge. With a deep breath, the girl drew her hands back, and the glow around her intensified. It was like the last spark of something ancient, something far beyond anything he could comprehend. The ground trembled again, but this time it wasn't from the creature's force, it was from hers. The energy in the air shifted, bending, twisting, gathering around her like a storm ready to unleash. The creature moved, its long, twisted limbs jerking toward her. But it was too late. In a flash, the girl thrust her hands forward, and the entire landscape seemed to shift. A wave of energy surged outward, a burst of power that was unlike anything the hunter had ever seen. The creature let out a deafening screech, its form flickering in and out of existence, like it was being torn apart from the inside. The hunter was thrown to the ground, the force of the blast sending him tumbling. When he finally regained his footing, he saw the creature collapsing. It writhed, its form distorting as if it were being pulled apart by an invisible force. The sky above cracked with lightning, but the light from the girl was so intense that it pierced through the storm. And then, with a final, guttural roar, the creature dissolved into nothingness. It was gone. The girl collapsed to her knees, the light around her fading, leaving her utterly drained. Her body trembled, her breathing shallow as she fought to stay conscious. The ground beneath them settled, the chasm closing slowly, and the storm seemed to die down in response to the creature's death. But even as the immediate threat disappeared, the hunter felt a deep, uneasy stillness in the air. He rushed to her side, kneeling beside her. "You did it," he said, his voice barely a whisper, though he didn't know who he was trying to convince, more her or himself. She smiled weakly, her eyes flicking toward him. I didn't do it alone," she whispered. "It's not over." The hunter frowned, confused. "What do you mean?" "It's gone. We're safe." She shook her head slowly. "No, this is just the beginning. What we just saw, it's part of something much larger. The creature. It wasn't the end. It was just one of many." Before he could ask, her eyes shifted, her expression hardening. "The ships. They were just the first wave. The real battle is coming. And it's not just for this world, it's for all worlds." The hunter's blood ran cold. "You mean there's more?" She nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "There's always more." The ground beneath them trembled again, but this time it wasn't just the earth. It was a vibration in the air, a hum that resonated deep in his bones. It was distant at first, but it was growing louder. And as the sky above them began to crack once more, a familiar hum filled the air. More ships. Dozens of them. Hundreds. The hunter stood, his heart pounding. "What do we do now?" he asked, the weight of it all crashing down on him. The girl looked up at the sky, her eyes flashing with something he hadn't seen before, a spark of hope. She wasn't afraid. "Not anymore. We fight," she said, her voice steady. "We fight or we die. But we're not going down without a fight." The hunter's gaze turned toward the horizon, where the first ships had begun to descend. The battle was far from over. It had only just begun. But as he looked back at the girl, he realized something. In that moment, he wasn't just fighting for survival. He was fighting for something much bigger than himself. And with the girl by his side, he was ready to face whatever came next. And then, without warning, a sharp, searing light appeared in the sky. It wasn't the ships. It wasn't the storm. It was something else, something ancient, something beyond comprehension. The girl's face paled as the light grew brighter, and she whispered, "They're here. The ones who control it all. The ones who started this war." The hunter's blood ran cold as the light expanded, consuming the sky. There was no escaping it now. The true enemy had just revealed itself. And everything they thought they knew was about to change. The sky above them seemed to pulse with an unnatural rhythm, as if the very fabric of space was bending and stretching under the weight of the light that now filled the heavens. It wasn't the light of a star or the flash of an explosion, it was something far older, far more powerful. A force that seemed to reach into the deepest corners of the universe, like the echo of something that had existed long before time itself had begun. The hunter could feel the change in the air, the oppressive heaviness of it pressing down on his chest. He had faced many dangers in his life, battles, wars, merciless hunters, and ruthless enemies, but nothing had prepared him for this. Not the ships, not the creatures, not even the storm had felt like this. The girl's face had drained of color, and her hands trembled as she tried to steady herself. She had seen this before. He could tell. This wasn't the first time she had witnessed this kind of power. It was something beyond their understanding, beyond the scope of everything they had known. She looked at him, her expression resolute despite the fear creeping into her eyes. They are coming. The true rulers of this galaxy. The ones who have been pulling the strings all along. The ones who have shaped everything. All of this war, these creatures, the invasion, it's all part of their plan. And now they're here to finish what they started. The hunter swallowed hard, his mind racing as the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. The invaders, the creatures, the ships, they hadn't come to conquer. They hadn't come to take the planet. They had come to test. To see if the world was ready. Ready for what, though? That was the question that lingered in the hunter's mind, but it didn't matter. He couldn't focus on that right now. There was no time for questions. The light grew brighter, more intense, until it filled the entire sky, a blinding beacon that drowned out everything else. The ships that had once been threatening in their descent now seemed insignificant, dwarfed by the vastness of the light. They were nothing compared to the force that was coming. "Do you know what they want?" the hunter asked, his voice tight with uncertainty. The girl's gaze turned inward, her eyes distant as though she were reaching back into memories that were not her own. "I know what they want," she said slowly. "But I don't know if we can stop it. They've been preparing for this for millennia. They have their agents in place, their armies ready. And they've already begun the process." "The process of what?" the hunter demanded, urgency seeping into his tone. The girl opened her mouth to speak, but before she could say anything more, a sound erupted from the light, a deafening, otherworldly hum that vibrated through every cell in the hunter's body. It was as if the light itself had become alive, sending ripples of power through the very atmosphere. And then, as the hunter watched, the light began to take shape. From the center of the blinding brightness, a colossal figure emerged. It was humanoid in shape, but its proportions were wrong, too large, too alien. Its skin shimmered with an iridescent sheen, and its eyes, though impossibly vast, were empty, hollow pits that seemed to reflect the void itself. It stood like a god, towering over them, casting a shadow that stretched across the horizon. The power emanating from it was overwhelming, suffocating. The girl staggered back, her hands trembling. "That's them," she whispered. "The ones who control it all." The hunter felt a chill run down his spine. The creature before them was no mere alien. It wasn't just another invader. This was something far beyond anything he could comprehend. The power radiating from it was like a flood, a force that seemed to crush everything beneath it. But the girl wasn't backing down. Even in the face of this impossible being, she stood tall, her posture unwavering. The light around her began to flicker once more, though it was weak. Her hands shook, but her resolve was undeniable. "Do you understand now?" she said, her voice steady despite the terror in her eyes. "This is why we're here. Why we've been fighting. They didn't come to conquer. They came to test. They came to see if the galaxy is ready." "Ready for what?" "Ready for their power. For their rule. For the end of everything that we know." She turned to face the creature, her eyes filled with a mixture of defiance and sorrow. "But we're not going to let them have it. We're not going to let them take everything we fought for." The hunter felt his heart beat faster as the weight of her words settled in. This was bigger than him. Bigger than her. It was about the very fate of the galaxy, of all worlds. And even if they couldn't defeat them, they couldn't let these beings have it all. The girl had been right. There was no choice but to fight. As if reading his thoughts, the girl's eyes flicked to him, and she gave him a small, determined smile. "We fight, or we perish." He nodded, but in his chest, the doubt still lingered. Could they actually stop this? Could they even stand a chance against something so ancient, so powerful? And then, as if the universe itself was answering him, the creature before them shifted. It raised one long, alien arm, and the ground trembled once again. The atmosphere around them crackled, charged with an energy that he could feel deep in his bones. This was no ordinary power. This was the kind of force that could shatter entire worlds. But the girl wasn't afraid. She stepped forward, her arms raised, and the light around her flared once more. It was faint, but it was enough. The light burned bright with a furious intensity that seemed to challenge the creature before them. For a moment, time seemed to slow. The wind fell still. The ships in the sky halted their descent. The girl's voice rang out, louder than the hum of the alien creature. "We will not bow to you. We will not surrender." For a long moment, there was silence. And then, in an instant, the ground beneath them cracked, and the entire sky split open. The hunter felt a surge of power shoot through the air as the full force of the creature's might was unleashed. But something unexpected happened. The girl's light flared brighter than ever before, radiating with a force that clashed against the creature's power. The two forces collided, like two titans battling in the heavens. The sky erupted in a burst of light and sound, a shockwave that knocked the hunter off his feet. He was disoriented, but he fought to regain his balance, to focus on what was happening. The girl was still standing, though barely. Her body was flickering, the light around her pulsing erratically. She was using everything she had. Every ounce of her energy, her will, her very soul. She was fighting for the galaxy. The creature's form began to waver, as if it were losing its grip on reality. Its movements became more erratic, its power weakening. And then, with one final, earth-shattering pulse, the creature exploded in a burst of light, its form disintegrating into the air. The hunter stumbled back, his heart pounding. The storm above them began to dissipate, the sky clearing. The ships that had filled the sky fell silent, their engines no longer humming. And then, there was peace. A quiet calm that spread over the land. The girl collapsed to her knees, her light fading, her body weak. But she had done it. She had won. The hunter knelt beside her, his hand reaching out to her. She looked up at him, her eyes filled with both exhaustion and a strange, bittersweet relief. "We did it," she whispered. "We stopped them. For now." The battle had been won. But the war was far from over. The galaxy was still out there, still waiting for its future to be written. And though the enemy had been vanquished, the hunter knew that they weren't finished. They had only just begun to understand the depths of the war that had been waged for so long. But they had won this fight. And that was enough for now. As they stood together, side by side, the horizon stretched out before them vast, unknown, but filled with the promise of hope. And for the first time in a long time, the hunter felt something he hadn't felt in years. A flicker of hope for the future. They would face whatever came next. Together.